Imagine a huge army, 80,000 strong, the most powerful in all of America. They're up against tribes that don't have big empires, fancy stone cities, or lots of gold. And guess what? Against all odds, the tribes without an empire win. This is the amazing story of how the biggest empire on the continent was stopped dead in its tracks by a group of people that Spanish writers later called the fiercest of all. We're talking about the clash between the Inca Empire and the Mapuche people. What you're about to discover will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about old conquests in America, because there's something no one tells you in history class. While Europe was split into many small kingdoms in South America, there was a giant empire that stretched for over 2,500 miles. This empire had taken over dozens of other groups. They built roads that were as good as the famous Roman roads. They moved armies of 100,000 men with perfect order like a well-oiled machine. These were the Incas, and they seemed impossible to stop. But then they reached the south, to the land of the Mapuche, where the river runs cold from the mountains. And there in those lands, they found something they had never faced before, an enemy who would rather die than give up. The Mapuche didn't have an emperor. They didn't have golden temples or strong stone forts, but they had something that would make the Incas tremble. They had a warrior culture so fierce that it turned the empire's expansion into a horrible nightmare that lasted for 30 years. This untold battle isn't just one fight, it's a war. A war that lasted for generations and ended in the most surprising way possible. But to understand how a people without an empire stopped the most advanced war machine in America, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand who the Incas were when they got to the Maule River, and we need to understand why what they found there terrified them. It's the year 1460 AD. The Inca ruler Pacification has just changed Cusco from a small kingdom into the center of a huge empire. His name means he who transforms the earth, and he certainly lived up to it. In less than 30 years, Pacification conquered land after land. He took over the Chancas, the Lupacas, and the Quillas. His army was a perfect conquering machine, but Pacification didn't just conquer with fighting. He had a system, a method. First, he would send messengers with gifts. He'd offer to be friends and promise to protect them. He'd talk about how great it would be to join the Tahuantinsuyo, the empire of the 4 regions. If they agreed, great. They'd become part of the empire, keep their local leaders, and pay taxes. But they'd also get good roads and irrigation systems. It was a deal hard to say no to. But if they did say no, then came the second step, a show of power. The Inca army wasn't like other armies you might have seen. It was perfectly organized into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Each group had its own leader. Getting supplies was flawless. They had supply depots every so often along the empire's roads. They could move huge armies without anyone starving. They used slings to throw deadly stones, bronze-spiked clubs, spears, and axes. And they had something else, discipline. They trained from childhood. They knew how to form lines, move together, and attack in organized waves. When Pacification died, his son Túpac Yupanqui took over, and Túpac was even more ambitious. He looked at the map of the Tahuantinsuyo and saw that there was a lot of land missing to the south. So he put together the biggest army the empire had ever seen. He gathered more than 40,000 warriors. The goal, to conquer all the way to where the known world ended. South, always south. The first conquests were pretty easy. The people in the north of what is now Chile joined the empire. Some fought, but the empire's bigger numbers and better organization were too much for them. Túpac Yupanqui built forts, set up resting places, tambos, and extended the Inca road. Everything was going according to plan. The empire grew and taxes flowed to Cusco. The imperial machine worked perfectly until they reached the Maule River. That's where everything changed. Because on the other side of the river, watching the Inca army come closer, were the Mapuche. And the Mapuche weren't like the other people the Incas had conquered. They didn't have a king to bribe or capture. They didn't have a capital city to surround. They were made up of many separate groups, each with its own leader or toki. And they had a warrior tradition that turned every man into a soldier from the time he could hold a spear. The Incas sent messengers, as always. They offered a peaceful joining of the empire. They told them about the wonders of the Tahuantinsuyo, the roads, the protection, and how their lives would get better under the rule of the Sapa Inca, the son of the sun god. The Mapuche listened, and then they did something that shocked the messengers. They refused the offer, not with fear, not with doubt, but with complete scorn. The Mapuche had a message for the Inca: go back north. These lands are not for you. Here there is no emperor, no taxes, no giving up. If you cross the Maule, you will cross to your death. Túpac Yupanqui couldn't believe it. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one. The messengers returned to the Inca camp with the answer, and the supreme commander had to make a decision. He could retreat, except that there was a limit to his empire, or he could do what he had always done, crush the resistance with overwhelming force. The choice was obvious. Imperial pride wouldn't allow a retreat. Túpac Yupanqui ordered the attack to be prepared. But there was something the Incas didn't know, something they would find out the hard way. The Mapuche had been watching them for weeks. They had seen how they set up their camps, how they organized their formations, how they fought. And they had been getting ready, calling on neighboring groups, gathering warriors from all over the land, because the Mapuche had a system. When there was an outside threat, rival groups would put aside their differences and unite under a war toki. The toki chosen to face the Incas, whose name history didn't clearly record, but whose strategy was remembered in Mapuche stories for centuries, wasn't the strongest or the youngest warrior. He was the smartest, and he had a plan that would turn the Incas' advantage in numbers into a curse. The night before the battle, the Inca camp was quiet and confident. They had fought bigger armies before. They knew that tomorrow they would cross the river, form their lines, and the Mapuche would run away like so many other peoples had. It was the routine of conquest. But in the nearby hills, thousands of Mapuche warriors watched the Inca campfires and waited. At dawn, the Inca army began to cross the Maule. The river wasn't deep at that time of year. The warriors waded across in formation. The commanders organized the lines on the other bank. Everything was according to Inca military protocol: discipline, order, perfect coordination. And then, when about half the army had crossed, it happened. From the hills, 20,000 Mapuche came rushing down, shouting a war cry that made the ground shake. They didn't come in neat rows. They came in wild waves like a human flood. They carried long spears, clubs with stone heads, and bows. But their most effective weapon was something the Incas had never faced: the pure, unrestrained fury of warriors who weren't afraid to die. The Incas tried to form their classic defensive line: slingers in front, spearmen in the second row, reserves in the back. But the Mapuche didn't fight like the armies the Incas knew. They didn't want an orderly fight. They wanted chaos. They threw themselves against the Inca lines with such brutal violence that they broke the formation. And once the formation broke, the Incas' tactical advantage disappeared. The fight became hand-to-hand, bloody, and merciless. Mapuche warriors used hard wooden clubs that crushed skulls and spears that went through cotton armor. They fought with a fierceness that the Incas weren't prepared for, because the Incas fought for the empire, for taxes, on orders from the Sapa Inca. The Mapuche fought for their land, for their freedom, for their right not to bow down to anyone. Half of the Inca army, which was still crossing the river, found itself trapped. They couldn't help their comrades without being vulnerable in the water. Those who had already crossed were being slaughtered. Inca commanders shouted orders, but it was complete chaos. And then the Mapuche toki carried out the second part of his plan. Another group of Mapuche warriors attacked the side of the army that was still on the north bank of the river. Now the Incas were split, attacked from two sides, unable to use their larger numbers. The battle turned into a bloodbath. Bodies fell into the Maule, and the river literally turned red. It's not a metaphor, it's what chroniclers later wrote. The water ran red for hours. Túpac Yupanqui watched from a high spot, and for the first time in his military life, he understood that he was losing. Not just losing a small skirmish, he was losing a whole battle against an enemy that was supposed to be an easy conquest. He had two choices: send more troops and risk losing the entire army, or retreat and save what was left of his forces. The decision was brutal, but it was the only possible one. He ordered the retreat. The surviving Inca army crossed back over the Maule in complete disarray. The Mapuche chased them to the bank, but they didn't cross. They didn't need to cross. They had sent their message in the clearest way possible. This is our limit. Your empire ends here. The Inca losses were devastating. Thousands of warriors dead, thousands more wounded. Their morale shattered. Túpac Yupanqui set up a camp north of the Maule and sent messengers to Cusco. He needed reinforcements. He needed time to reorganize. But most of all, he needed to understand what the hell had just happened, because this wasn't supposed to happen. The Incas had conquered huge territories. They had brought down the Chinchas, expert warriors of the coast. They had defeated the Chimu with their adobe forts. They had crushed rebellions of mountain peoples, but never had they been stopped like this. So brutally, so completely. The Mapuche, on the other hand, returned to their lands. They celebrated their victory, but they weren't fooled. They knew the Incas would be back. An empire doesn't stop after one defeat. Empires have endless resources. They can recruit more warriors. They can try again, and again and again. So the Mapuche got ready. They strengthened their defenses, trained more warriors, and made alliances with neighboring groups. Because the war wasn't over, it had only just begun. And the Mapuche were right. Túpac Yupanqui was not a man to accept defeat. He was the son of Pacification, the transformer of the earth. He was the commander who had stretched the empire to unimaginable limits. A defeat at the mall wasn't the end, it was a temporary setback. So he did what any great strategist would do. He analyzed what went wrong and prepared a second campaign. But this time it would be different. This time he wouldn't underestimate the enemy. Months passed. Túpac Yupanqui received reinforcements from Cusco, more warriors, more supplies, more experienced commanders. He reorganized the army. He trained his troops in new tactics. He studied the land around the mall. He sent spies to watch the Mapuche movements. This time there would be no surprises. This time the empire would crush the resistance with careful planning and overwhelming force. The second attack began a year after the first defeat. The Inca army crossed the mall at a different spot where the river was wider but less deep. This time they crossed in a defensive formation, expecting an attack. They set up a fortified camp on the south bank. They built fences, dug ditches. Túpac Yupanqui wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. The Mapuche watched from the hills. They saw the fortified camp, they saw the renewed discipline of the Inca army, and they understood that this time would be different. They couldn't just rush the Inca positions and hope to break their lines. They needed a new strategy, and the Toki had one. Instead of attacking the main camp, the Mapuche warriors began a war of attrition. Night attacks against Inca patrols, ambushes on supply routes, quick raids against small groups of warriors who strayed from the main camp. The Mapuche knew every inch of this land, every hill, every valley, every forest. The Incas were in strange territory, and that advantage was deadly. Inca casualties slowly piled up. Not thousands in a single battle, but 10 here, 20 there, 50 in a well-planned ambush. But over time, they added up. And something worse than casualties began to affect the Inca army: fear. Inca warriors began to be afraid to leave the camp. They feared the darkness, they feared the forests, because they knew that out there, hidden, waiting for them, were the Mapuche. Túpac Yupanqui tried to force a decisive battle. He marched with the main part of his army into Mapuche territory, looking for the enemy. But the Mapuche didn't give him that satisfaction. When the Inca army approached, the Mapuche retreated, disappearing into the forests, into the mountains, avoiding a direct fight. And when the Incas retreated, exhausted, without having found the main enemy, the Mapuche reappeared, attacking the rear. They killed the stragglers and disappeared again. It was a perfect guerrilla tactic, and it was destroying the morale of the Inca army. Because Inca warriors were trained for open battles, for sieges, for fights where discipline and organization brought victory. They weren't trained for this shadow war where the enemy never stood still, never accepted a fight on unfavorable terms, never surrendered. Months passed. The Inca army remained stuck south of the mall. It couldn't advance without suffering unbearable losses. It couldn't retreat without admitting a humiliating defeat. Túpac Yupanqui faced a situation that no Inca commander had ever faced before: a stalemate. The empire that conquered nations in weeks had been unable to advance more than a few miles for months. And then the news arrived from Cusco. There were problems in the north of the empire. Rebellions, people who saw the imperial army stuck in the south and thought that perhaps, just perhaps, this was the moment to break free from Inca rule. Túpac Yupanqui needed to make a decision. He could stay in the south, obsessed with conquering the Mapuche while the empire crumbled in other regions. Or he could do the unthinkable. He could accept that the empire had a limit. The decision was agonizing. It went against everything Túpac Yupanqui believed. It went against the imperial idea that the Tahuantinsuyo was meant to rule the known world. But it was also a practical decision. A great commander not only knows when to attack, but also knows when to retreat to preserve what he already has. Túpac Yupanqui ordered the final retreat. It wasn't a chaotic flight like the first time. It was an organized, disciplined withdrawal. The Inca army crossed back over the mall and set up forts on the north bank. The unspoken message was clear. This is as far as we go. This is our southern limit. We will not cross again, but you also don't cross to the north. The Mapuche accepted that unspoken limit, not because they feared the Incas. They accepted it because they never wanted to conquer Inca territory. They only wanted to defend their own. They only wanted to be left alone, and they had succeeded. They had done something no other people in South America had achieved. They had stopped the expansion of the continent's largest empire. But the story doesn't end there, because even though Túpac Yupanqui accepted the mall as the border, he didn't accept complete defeat. He had a new plan. If he couldn't conquer the Mapuche by force, he would conquer them in another way, with time, with patience, with the strategy that had always worked for the empire: cultural assimilation. The Incas began to build settlements near the mall. They invited neighboring peoples to the Mapuche to join the empire. They offered them trade, protection, and advanced farming technology. Some accepted, not many, but some. And those peoples became buffer zones between Mapuche territory and Inca territory. The border stabilized. Túpac Yupanqui returned to Cusco. He crushed the rebellions in the north. He continued to expand the empire in other directions, to the east into the Amazon jungles and to the Pacific coast. The Tahuantinsuyo continued to grow, but to the south, the Maule remained like a scar, a reminder that even the largest empire had limits. Years passed. Túpac Yupanqui died and his son Huayna Cápac took power. Huayna Cápac was the last great Inca emperor. Under his rule, the empire reached its greatest size, millions of people, thousands of miles of territory, a network of roads that connected the entire empire, irrigation systems, forts, temples. It was the peak of Inca power. And Huayna Cápac also looked south. He also thought about the Mapuche. He also wondered if he would be the one to finally conquer what his father and grandfather could not. So he organized a third campaign, the biggest of all. He gathered an army of more than 50,000 warriors, the best commanders, the best weapons, the best logistics. This time, he was sure the empire would triumph. Huayna Cápac's army marched south with the confidence of someone commanding the most powerful military machine in America. But Huayna Cápac was also a smart strategist. He had studied his father's campaigns. He knew what went wrong. He knew that the Mapuche couldn't be defeated with traditional tactics, so he brought a new strategy. He wouldn't seek a decisive battle. He would seek gradual control of the territory through a network of forts. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Build pucara, stone forts at regular intervals, each garrisoned with permanent warriors. Connect them with roads. Establish colonies of mitimes. Loyal populations moved from the heart of the empire to colonize the conquered lands. It was the Roman strategy of border fortification, developed independently on the other side of the world, and in theory, it should work. The first forts were built without significant resistance. The Incas established positions north of the Maule and began to slowly extend south. They farmed the surrounding lands, brought families, and built tambos to store provisions. Each fort was a statement of permanence. "We came to stay," those stacked stones, with the characteristic precision of Inca architecture, seemed to say. The Mapuche watched and debated. Some Toquis argued that they should attack the forts immediately before they became too strong. Others pointed out that attacking fortified positions was exactly what the Incas wanted. It was taking the battle to the ground where the empire had an advantage. So they decided on a different strategy. They would let the Incas build their forts and then they would isolate them. The Mapuche strategy was devastatingly effective. They didn't attack the forts directly, they attacked everything else. The roads between forts, the supply caravans, the cultivated fields, the groups of workers. They turned each fort into an isolated island in the middle of hostile territory. The Inca garrisons found themselves trapped. They couldn't leave without risking ambushes. They couldn't receive supplies regularly. Slowly, inexorably, they began to starve. Huayna Cápac sent rescue expeditions, columns of warriors who tried to reach the besieged forts. Some succeeded, others were ambushed along the way. And those who arrived found that now there were more mouths to feed and the same scarce supplies. The situation became unbearable. One by one, the forts had to be evacuated. Or worse, their garrisons were massacred when they tried to retreat. It was the second great Inca defeat in Mapuche territory. Different from the first, less dramatic, without a bloody battle marking a turning point, but perhaps more humiliating, because it showed that even with preparation, even with the best fortifications, even with seemingly unlimited resources, the empire could not maintain an occupation in Mapuche territory. And then something extraordinary happened. Huayna Cápac did something no Inca emperor had ever done. He invited the Mapuche leaders to negotiate, not as conqueror and conquered, but as equals. It was an unspoken recognition of the obvious. The Mapuche could not be conquered. Not by force, not by forts, not by any known military strategy. The negotiations took place in neutral territory north of the Maule. The Mapuche Toquis arrived cautiously. They didn't trust the Incas, but they were also tired of constant war. They had lost warriors, they had lost crops. Permanent war came at a cost, even for the most warlike people. The agreement they reached was historic. The Maule would be the definitive border. The Incas would not try to cross it again. The Mapuche would not attack Inca territory north of the river. There would be limited trade between both peoples, exchange of goods but not of culture. The Mapuche would maintain their absolute independence. The Incas would maintain their imperial pride by declaring that they simply decided that the southern territory was not worth conquering. It was a lie, everyone knew it, but it was a lie that allowed both sides to claim victory. The Incas could say that they established the limits of the empire where they wanted. The Mapuche could say that they successfully defended their land against the most powerful empire in America. The truth is more complex. The Incas were stopped. The Mapuche preserved their freedom, and the Maule remained the border where imperial expansion died. Huayna Cápac returned to Cusco. He never again spoke of conquering the south. He focused on strengthening the empire, on managing the territories he already controlled, on building Quito as a second northern capital. The Mapuche issue became taboo in the imperial court. Inca victory songs did not mention the south. Official chroniclers vaguely spoke of territories that the empire decided not to conquer due to lack of interest. But in the barracks, among veteran warriors, everyone knew the truth. And the truth was that there was a people south of the Maule who were never subdued. A people without an empire, but with something more valuable, an unbreakable will to remain free. But this is where the story takes a turn that no one could have foreseen. Because while Incas and Mapuche established their uneasy border, while they learned to coexist in a tense peace, something was happening on the other side of the world, something that would change everything. In Europe, a man named Christopher Columbus had just convinced the Catholic monarchs to finance an impossible voyage, and that voyage would bring consequences that no American people could imagine. It's the year 1532 AD. 40 years have passed since Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, and the Spanish have been busy. They had conquered the Caribbean and destroyed the Aztec Empire under Hernán Cortés. They had heard rumors of another great empire to the south, an empire of gold and precious stones, an empire that stretched along the western coast of South America. Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru with fewer than 200 men. It was a ridiculously small force, but Pizarro had advantages that the American peoples had never faced: horses, firearms, steel armor. And above all, he had impossible luck because he arrived at the exact moment when the Inca Empire was torn apart by a civil war between two brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa. The Inca Civil War was brutal. Atahualpa finally won and captured Huáscar, but the empire was weakened, divided. And then these strange, bearded men appeared on beasts that no one had ever seen. Atahualpa, confident in his power, agreed to meet Pizarro in Cajamarca. It was a trap. Pizarro captured the emperor, massacred thousands of unarmed warriors, and with a single bold stroke decapitated the empire. What followed was the fastest and most devastating collapse an empire had ever experienced. Atahualpa offered an impossible ransom: to fill a room with gold and two with silver. The Incas complied. They melted down sacred statues, emptied temples, and brought treasures from all corners of the empire. Pizarro accepted the ransom and then executed Atahualpa anyway. It was pure betrayal, but it was effective betrayal. The Tahuantinsuyo disintegrated. Without an emperor, without centralized leadership, the conquered peoples saw their opportunity and rebelled. The Spanish conquered Cusco and set up a puppet emperor. The wars of conquest transformed into wars of resistance. Some Inca generals, like Manco Inca, fled to the mountains and continued fighting. But the empire as a coherent political structure had ceased to exist. And this is where our story takes its most ironic turn, because the Spanish, drunk with victory after destroying the Inca Empire, looked south, and they saw the same territories that the Incas could never conquer, Mapuche territory. And the Spanish, who had just defeated the largest empire in South America with fewer than 200 men, thought, if we conquered the Incas, conquering a few tribes without an empire will be trivial. They had no idea of the hell they were about to enter. Pedro de Valdivia was the conqueror chosen to subdue Chile. He was a veteran of the European wars and the conquest of Peru, experienced, brutal, ambitious. He left Cusco in 1540 AD with 150 Spaniards and thousands of indigenous auxiliaries, mostly Yanaconas, loyal or forced to serve. His goal: to found cities, establish encomiendas, land grants, subdue the natives, and extract riches. The standard manual of Spanish conquest. The first stages went well. Valdivia crossed the Atacama Desert, one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. He lost men and horses, but survived. He arrived in the Mapocho Valley and founded Santiago del Nuevo Extremo in 1541. The Picunches, the peoples of northern Chile, resisted, but they were subdued. Valdivia established encomiendas, distributed lands, and began extracting gold from the mines. Everything according to plan, but Valdivia was ambitious. Santiago wasn't enough. He wanted to expand south, to the fertile lands of the Biobío, to the territory that the Incas never conquered. He was sure that with steel armor, horses, and arquebuses, what the Incas failed to achieve in 3 decades, he would achieve in 3 months. It's the year 1546. Valdivia marched south with 60 Spanish cavalrymen and an army of indigenous helpers. He founded forts and cities as he went: Imperial Valdivia, Valerica, Each founding was an act of imperial arrogance, Spanish names on Mapuche land, Christian crosses planted in the ground, distribution of lands and people as if they were cattle. The Mapuche watched and remembered. They remembered when other men with empires came thinking that conquest would be easy. They remembered how those men learned with blood and pain that Mapuche territory is not conquered, not subdued, not given up. And these new invaders with their strange beasts and their thunder sticks were about to receive the same lesson. The first contact was misleading. Some Mapuche agreed to work for the Spanish in the gold mines. They seemed submissive, seemed defeated. Valdivia relaxed. He thought the conquest was complete. He sent letters to Spain talking about his successes. He asked for more settlers. He planned to establish a personal kingdom in Chile. His arrogance had no limits, but the Mapuche who worked in the mines were not defeated. They were learning, watching, studying these strange invaders. They learned how horses worked, how they got scared by fire, how a rider could be knocked off. They learned that steel armor was strong but had vulnerable joints. They learned that arquebuses made a lot of noise but took a long time to reload. And most importantly, they learned that under the armor and weapons, these invaders bled just like any other man. And then in 1553, the Mapuche rose up. It wasn't a disorganized rebellion, it was a coordinated war that broke out simultaneously throughout the territory. The Toquis had been meeting in secret. They had chosen a supreme leader for this war. His name was Lautaro. Lautaro was extraordinary. He was young, probably in his early 20s, but he had something that made him unique. He knew the enemy from the inside. Lautaro was captured by the Spanish when he was a teenager. He served as a Yanacona, an aide to Valdivia himself. He took care of his horses, observed his tactics, learned Spanish. And when he had the chance, he escaped and returned to his people. He brought with him invaluable knowledge. The Spanish were not invincible. They were men, and men could die. Lautaro convinced the Toquis to change the way the Mapuche fought. Traditionally, Mapuche warriors attacked in massive waves, relying on numerical strength and individual ferocity. Lautaro proposed something different: organization, tactics, using the Spanish forts against themselves. The first test of Lautaro's new tactics happened at the fort of Tucapel. It was a small Spanish fort garrisoned by 26 men. The Mapuche surrounded it. When the Spanish came out to fight, Lautaro organized his warriors in waves that attacked and retreated. They didn't seek a direct clash where Spanish armor gave an advantage. They sought to wear down the enemy, and it worked. The Spanish, with their heavy armor, got exhausted. And when they were exhausted, vulnerable, the Mapuche launched the final attack. 26 Spaniards dead, not a single survivor. The news reached Valdivia, and Valdivia made the mistake Lautaro was waiting for. He underestimated the enemy. He thought that a group of rebel Indians had been lucky against a small garrison. He thought that if he marched personally with his best cavalry, he would crush the rebellion in a day. So he left Concepcion with 50 Spanish horsemen, the best of the best, veterans of Europe and of the wars against the Incas, knights in full armor, the military elite of the conquest. They marched towards Tucapel, and Lautaro was waiting for them. Lautaro had chosen the terrain perfectly. It was a wooded area where horses could not maneuver freely, where the Spanish cavalry lost its mobility advantage. And he had organized thousands of Mapuche warriors in staggered groups, each with specific instructions. They were not going to fight as a disorganized horde. They were going to fight as an army. Valdivia arrived in the Tucapel area on the afternoon of December 25, 1553. It was Christmas. Valdivia probably thought it was a good omen. It wasn't. His scouts reported Mapuche warriors in the nearby forest, not many. Valdivia ordered a charge. The Spanish horsemen spurred their horses, lowered their lances, and launched themselves against the visible enemy. The Mapuche retreated, fleeing into the forest. Valdivia and his men pursued them. It was exactly what Lautaro wanted. The Spanish entered the terrain that Lautaro had prepared, and then from the flanks, from behind, from hidden positions, thousands of Mapuche warriors emerged. The Battle of Tucapel was a massacre. The Spanish tried to form their line, but they were surrounded. The Mapuche had learned to attack the horses. First, they threw arrows and spears at the beasts, not the riders. A wounded horse becomes uncontrollable, throws its rider, and a dismounted Spaniard with his heavy armor is vulnerable. Mapuche warriors used long clubs that struck the joints of the armor. They used lassos to drag riders off their mounts. They used the terrain, the trees, the numerical advantage, and above all, they used the absolute ferocity of warriors who were fighting for their land against invaders who wanted to enslave them. The battle lasted for hours. The Spanish fought desperately. They were veterans. They killed many Mapuche. But for every Mapuche who fell, 2 more took their place. Lautaro was everywhere, shouting orders, reorganizing his warriors, directing the attack with the precision of a great commander. One by one, the Spanish fell, their horses dead or fled, their armor dented by the blows of the clubs, their strength exhausted. And finally, only a small group remained, defending themselves around Pedro de Valdivia. The conqueror of Chile, the founder of Santiago, the man who thought that conquering the Mapuche would be a minor campaign. The Mapuche offered Valdivia the opportunity to surrender. He refused, fought until he was captured alive, wounded, exhausted. What happened next? There are different versions in the chronicles. Some say he was executed immediately. Others say he was subjected to a ritual where he was made to drink molten gold, a symbolic death for his greed. What is certain is that Pedro de Valdivia died in Tucapel, and with him died the 50 best Spanish horsemen in Chile. It was the greatest Spanish defeat in the entire conquest of America. More devastating than any battle against the Aztecs, more humiliating than any setback against the Incas. Because here, a group of ordinary soldiers did not die. The governor of Chile himself died. The elite of the Spanish cavalry died, and the message his death sent was thunderous. The Mapuche not only resisted, they won. News of Tucapel spread throughout Spanish Chile. Panic was absolute. The southern cities were hastily evacuated. Settlers fled to Santiago. Indigenous auxiliaries deserted en masse. Encomiendas were abandoned. In weeks, everything Valdivia had built south of the Biobío crumbled. Lautaro did not stop. Now he had momentum. He had a legendary victory that had turned Mapuche warriors from all over the territory into believers in his tactics. He reorganized the Mapuche army into units that could operate independently. He created Mapuche cavalry squadrons, riding captured horses and training their own riders. He was transforming the Mapuche from tribal warriors into a modern army, and his ultimate goal was audacious to the point of madness: conquer Santiago, expel the Spanish from Chile completely. Lautaro marched north with thousands of warriors, attacking and destroying Spanish forts along the way. Each victory brought more warriors to his cause. Each Spanish defeat weakened the morale of the invaders. The Spanish in Santiago were terrified. They sent desperate messages to Peru asking for reinforcements. They fortified the city, trained militias, but they knew that if Lautaro arrived with the army he was gathering, Santiago would fall. And if Santiago fell, the Spanish presence in Chile would end. Lautaro arrived near Santiago in 1554. He set up a camp and began to plan the siege. But here he made his first strategic mistake. Instead of attacking immediately, he waited. He wanted to gather more forces. He wanted to ensure absolute victory. This gave the desperate Spanish time, and they used that time. They organized a preemptive attack expedition, 60 Spanish horsemen under the command of Francisco de Villagra. It was a suicide mission. They were going to attack a camp with thousands of Mapuche warriors, but they had two advantages: the element of surprise and the absolute desperation of men who knew that if they didn't win this battle, all was lost. The attack happened at dawn. The Spanish charged directly into the center of the Mapuche camp, looking for Lautaro. Chaos was absolute. The surprised Mapuche tried to organize themselves. Lautaro shouted orders, tried to coordinate the defense, but the Spanish attack was so audacious, so unexpected, that it broke the cohesion of the camp. And in the midst of the chaos, a Spanish spear found Lautaro. The young military genius fell, and with his fall, the Mapuche attack on Santiago crumbled. The warriors, without their leader, retreated. The opportunity to expel the Spanish from Chile was lost. Lautaro was dead at 23, but his legacy was just beginning. Because although Lautaro died, what he started did not die with him. He had shown that the Spanish could be defeated. He had taught tactics that worked against cavalry and arquebuses. He had created a tradition of resistance that would become the very identity of the Mapuche people. Lautaro's death did not bring peace to Chile. On the contrary, other Mapuche leaders took his place: Copalacan, Galvarino, Pelantaro. Each continued the war with the same ferocity, and the Spanish discovered something terrifying. They were not fighting against a charismatic leader who could be eliminated. They were fighting against an entire culture that had made resistance its reason for being. Copalacan was chosen as supreme Toqui after Lautaro. Spanish chronicles say he was chosen through a test of endurance. Candidates had to carry a heavy log on their shoulders. Whoever carried it the longest would be the leader. Copalacan carried it for 2 days and 2 nights without rest. Truth or myth? The story illustrates the type of leader he was: relentless, resilient, unwavering. Under Copalacan, the war continued with increasing brutality on both sides. The Spanish, frustrated by years of resistance, began to use terror tactics. They publicly executed prisoners, cut off the hands and noses of captives to send a message. In a particularly atrocious incident, they captured Galvarino, a Mapuche warrior, and cut off both his hands before releasing him as a warning. Galvarino returned to his people, and instead of hiding, he became a living symbol of resistance. He fought in later battles with spears tied to the stumps where he once had hands. His image terrified the Spanish more than any armed warrior, because it showed that even mutilated, even broken, the Mapuche would not surrender. The Spanish tried to change their strategy. If they couldn't conquer by force, they would try to divide. They offered peace treaties to some Mapuche groups. They promised to leave them alone if they accepted nominal Spanish rule. Some groups, tired of decades of war, accepted. Others saw these offers for what they were, attempts to divide and conquer. Caupolicán was eventually betrayed by one of his own and captured by the Spanish in 1558. His execution was designed to be a spectacle of terror. He was impaled alive, a slow and agonizing death intended to break the Mapuche spirit. It didn't work. His martyrdom simply created another symbol of resistance, another name that Mapuche mothers would whisper to their children, along with stories of never giving up. And this is where the war between Spain and the Mapuche takes on a unique character in the entire history of American colonization. Because while in the rest of the continent indigenous resistance was crushed in decades, in Chile the war continued and continued and continued, not for years, but for centuries. The Spanish established a formal military border at the Biobío River in 1593. 40 years after Valdivia's death, they officially admitted what was already obvious. They could not conquer Mapuche territory south of the Biobío. So they did what the Incas had done 150 years earlier. They established a border and built forts along it. The Biobío border became the open wound of the Spanish Empire in America. It was a constant reminder that even the empire where the sun never set had limits. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers were permanently stationed in the forts. Thousands of pesos were spent each year maintaining the border. And despite all that, Mapuche attacks continued. Each Spanish generation thought they would be the one to finally subdue the Mapuche. They sent new governors with new strategies. They tried peaceful evangelization, they tried total war, they tried treaties, they tried to buy loyalties. Nothing worked permanently. The Mapuche adapted to each new strategy. They learned, evolved, survived. And something extraordinary began to happen. The Mapuche not only resisted, they prospered. They learned to breed horses better than the Spanish. They developed their own cavalry that could fight on equal terms with Spanish horsemen. They adopted the use of long spears, perfectly designed for mounted combat. They traded with the Spanish when it suited them and attacked them when it didn't. The 17th century brought the Great Mapuche Uprising of 1655. It was a coordinated rebellion that destroyed all the Spanish cities south of the Biobío. Valdivia, Imperial, Valerica, Osorno. All razed, thousands of Spaniards killed or captured. Decades of colonization erased in months. The Spanish had to retreat again north of the Biobío. The border solidified as an invisible but impassable wall. The parliaments began in the 17th century. These were formal meetings between Spanish representatives and Mapuche Toquis where they negotiated as equal powers. It was not conqueror and conquered. It was empire and independent nation. The Spanish called it the Kingdom of Chile, north of the Biobío, and tacitly recognized Mapuche autonomy to the south. It was an unofficial but real recognition of the impossible. A stateless people had fought a world empire to a draw. The treaties of the parliaments were regularly violated by both sides. There were periods of relative peace interrupted by explosions of violence, but the border remained generation after generation. The Biobío was the limit where Spanish imperial power ended, exactly as the Maule was the limit where Inca imperial power ended. And then came the 19th century. Wars of independence broke out all over Latin America. The Creoles rebelled against Spain. Chile declared its independence in 1810. Bernardo O'Higgins and José de San Martin fought to free the new nation from Spanish rule and won. Chile was free, but there was a problem. The new Chilean government inherited the Biobío border and inherited the Mapuche problem. The liberators, men who fought for the freedom of their people, now faced the uncomfortable question, what to do with another people who also wanted their freedom. Some Mapuche leaders supported Chilean independence, thinking it would be better than Spanish rule. Others were skeptical. The skeptics were right. The independent Republic of Chile looked south with the same greedy eyes that the Incas and the Spanish had. They saw fertile lands, they saw forests, they saw opportunities, and they saw the Mapuche as an obstacle to progress and modernization. The rhetoric changed, but the intention was the same, to subdue the people who had never been subdued. During the first decades after independence, Chile was too busy establishing itself as a nation to focus on the South. There were civil wars, there were conflicts with Peru and Bolivia. But in 1860, with the nation's stabilized and growing expansionist ambitions, the Chilean government decided that the time had come to solve the Mapuche problem once and for all. They called it the Pacification of Araucanía. The name was an obscene lie. It wasn't pacification, it was invasion, it was conquest. It was the final attempt to break 300 years of Mapuche resistance. The Chilean army, now equipped with modern rifles, artillery, telegraph, all the advantages of 19th century technology, marched into Mapuche territory. The campaign began in 1862 and would last more than 20 years. It would not be easy. It never is with the Mapuche. But this time, technology made the difference. Repeating rifles could fire faster than any warrior could charge. Artillery destroyed fortifications from impossible distances. The telegraph allowed troop movements to be coordinated instantly. But even with all these advantages, the Mapuche resisted fiercely. Quilipan, a Toki of this era, organized the resistance with the same tactical intelligence that Lautaro demonstrated 300 years earlier. He used guerrilla warfare, attacked supply lines, avoided pitched battles where the Chilean army had a technological advantage. He turned every kilometer of territory into a costly battle. The Chilean army responded with systematic brutality. They burned rucas, the traditional Mapuche dwellings. They destroyed crops, confiscated cattle, displaced entire populations. It was a war of extermination disguised as a military campaign. Thousands of Mapuche died. Thousands more were displaced from their ancestral lands. In 1881, the Chilean army declared victory. They had established forts throughout Mapuche territory. They had divided the lands into plots for Chilean and European settlers. They had confined the Mapuche to reductions, small portions of land that were a fraction of what they once controlled. After 400 years of resistance, after defeating two empires, the Mapuche had finally been subdued.